The town had been buzzing with whispers for days, though no one dared say it directly to her face. She walked through the dusty main street, her hands gripping the brim of her worn straw hat, feeling the sting of every stare and every pointed finger. They called her foolish, reckless, even disgraceful. She had married an Apache, they said, as if that alone made her choices shameful. But no words could touch the pride that quietly burned in her chest, the steady rhythm of her heart that refused to yield to their judgments. She had made her choice, and she would not apologize for it. Her husband rode beside her now, a figure both commanding and calm, his long black hair falling over the broad shoulders of his coatless frame. Every movement he made was deliberate, each step in the stirrups measured and sure. The townsfolk might see only the surface, a man who did not belong in their orderly lives, a man who carried the scent of the open plains, but she saw the strength beneath the quiet, the intelligence in his dark, steady eyes, and the loyalty that never wavered. He had never sought their approval, nor did he need it. She remembered the first time she had seen him outside the canyon where his people camped. The sun had been low, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and gold. He had been mending a bow, hands steady as he worked, and when he looked up, his gaze had met hers without fear or hesitation. There was something about him, something that spoke of honor and courage, a fire that burned without cruelty. From that moment, she had known that the world she had grown up in, the narrow-minded judgments, the petty rules, would never hold her. When she returned to the town to announce their marriage, the reaction had been swift and unkind. Old men spat from their porches, women whispered behind lace curtains, and even neighbors she had known since childhood turned their eyes away. She could hear the words, sharp as broken glass. She was ruined. He was a savage. How could she do such a thing? Their insults struck with force, meant to wound, but they did not break her. She held her head high, letting the heat rise to her cheeks not in shame but in defiance. He, on the other hand, remained unshaken. His calm presence was a shield, a wall she leaned against when the world threatened to crush her. The townspeople had expected fear, or perhaps a spark of anger, but they found neither. Instead, they saw a man who moved with a quiet confidence that unnerved them. They did not know him yet, did not see the depth of who he was, and that ignorance fueled their contempt. At night, she would sit by the small fire outside their modest cabin, listening to the sounds of the plains, wind rustling the tall grass, distant calls of animals returning home, and she would watch him. He never boasted of his skills or his past, but the stories were in the way he handled himself, the way he understood the land, the way he protected those around him without a word. Every task he touched, from repairing fences to hunting for their meals, carried the imprint of his discipline and his knowledge. It was a quiet mastery, the kind that spoke louder than any boast or claim. The first morning after their return, the town seemed to simmer with unspoken tension. She walked past the general store and could feel the eyes drilling into her back. Some turned away quickly, embarrassed, while others lingered with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. She caught fragments of conversations, words that were meant to shame her but instead only reminded her of the courage she had discovered within herself. Her husband followed her at a distance, a silent guardian whose presence alone seemed to alter the atmosphere. People would see him and flinch, though he did nothing aggressive. He simply carried himself with a dignity that did not beg for recognition but demanded respect. They did not yet know the man behind the eyes, the layers of strength, skill, and intelligence they had underestimated. There was a moment when a group of men at the saloon whispered loudly enough for her to hear, mocking her decision and imagining that she had married for naive reasons, for fleeting romance. She turned to face them, and for a second, her heart thumped with a desire to confront their ignorance directly. But he placed a hand on her shoulder, a grounding weight, and she felt her resolve steady. Words would not settle this. Time would. Days passed, and slowly the whispers began to shift. It was not immediate, and it was not complete, but small things began to change. A neighbor who had once avoided her helped carry firewood to her cabin. A shopkeeper who had sneered now offered a courteous nod as they passed. They were beginning to notice that her husband was not the man they had imagined. They could sense it in the way he tracked a herd of deer with precision, in the way he negotiated a deal without anger or deception, in the way he guided her through threats she could not yet see. She knew that eventually the truth would reach them. He was not just an Apache. He was someone with a past and a presence that commanded acknowledgement. She had seen glimpses of it in the stories whispered around campfires at night, in tales of bravery and honor that could not be ignored. The town would understand someday that the man they had judged so harshly was not only capable but exceptional, a force of nature tempered by wisdom and loyalty. But that day had not yet arrived. For now, the town remained skeptical, and she remained cautious. Each interaction was a careful dance, testing boundaries, gauging reactions, and waiting for the moment when they could no longer deny the truth. She had learned patience, though it was difficult. Anger rose like a storm at times, but she channeled it into determination. She would not let the narrow-mindedness of the town dictate her life or her choices. One afternoon, as she and her husband rode along the ridge overlooking the valley, she felt a quiet shift in the air. The wind carried more than just the scent of sagebrush. It carried the subtle acknowledgement of his reputation, though most were yet unaware of it. A rider appeared on the horizon, approaching fast, and her stomach tightened with instinctual tension. He noticed it immediately, his eyes narrowing with alert focus. In that instant, she understood that the town's misconceptions were not the only threats they faced. Danger could appear without warning, and he would be ready. They met the rider at the edge of the town's clearing. His approach was urgent, the horse kicking up clouds of dust as it galloped. He dismounted with haste, eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. The words tumbled out, broken and hurried, but the meaning was clear. They had discovered something about him, something that shifted the balance of their judgment. She felt her pulse quicken as she glanced at her husband. He stood silent, commanding, an unshakable presence that spoke volumes even without a word. The man's revelation hinted at a past none in the town had known, a truth that would soon unravel their assumptions. The crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion, sensing the change in tension but unaware of the details. Whispers rippled through the streets like wildfire, spreading fragments of the story, half-truths, and speculation. Their curiosity was piqued, their certainty shaken. For the first time, she felt them hesitate, unsure of the judgments they had so confidently made. Her husband finally spoke, his voice steady and calm, carrying authority without arrogance. The words were few, but each one carried weight, hinting at a story far greater than anyone had imagined. She watched the crowd, noting the shift in expressions, from sneering contempt to wary respect, from doubt to the beginnings of recognition. The moment was fragile, like a thread stretched taut, and she sensed that the true test had only just begun. She reached for his hand, feeling the strength and reassurance that had guided her through so many days of scorn and suspicion. Together, they stood on the threshold of a revelation that would change everything. The town had insulted her, belittled her choice, and dismissed the man she had chosen. Yet now, the tide was turning, and the first hints of understanding had begun to surface. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, shadows that seemed to mirror the lingering doubts and fears of those who watched. She could feel it, the quiet anticipation, the unspoken tension that hung heavy in the air. Soon, everyone would know who he truly was. Soon, they would see the strength, the honor, and the courage that she had recognized from the very beginning. But the story was far from over. The town's realization was only the beginning, a spark that could ignite conflict, respect, or perhaps even envy. And as she and her husband turned their gaze to the horizon, she knew that the path ahead would test them in ways no one yet understood. Their journey was just beginning, And the moment when the town would fully comprehend the man she had chosen was approaching fast, carrying with it the promise of revelation and the threat of consequences that neither could ignore. The wind carried whispers through the streets, shifting like shadows in the fading light. She tightened her grip on his hand, feeling the solid reassurance that had never failed her. Around them, the town held its collective breath, caught between disbelief and awe. And she knew that when the truth fully emerged, no one would ever look at her or at him the same way again. The horizon blazed with the colors of the setting sun, and in that glow, she saw the hint of a new beginning, one forged by courage, choice, and a love that refused to bow to the judgment of others. The question remained, however, whether the town was ready to face it, or whether their ignorance would push them to challenge what they could not yet comprehend. And in the quiet tension of that moment, she realized that everything was about to change and nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed were quiet in the town, though the quiet was tense, like a rope pulled tight. She and her husband moved among the familiar streets, yet everything felt different now. The whispers had not stopped. They had only shifted, laced with curiosity instead of open ridicule. People lingered behind shutters or glanced quickly from windows, trying to catch a hint of the man she had chosen without seeming obvious. She could feel the weight of their attention, a mix of fear and fascination, but she walked tall, letting their eyes pass over her without fear. Her husband never sought to impress anyone. He did not parade his skills or recount stories of his past, though she knew they would eventually emerge. Instead, he lived in action and quiet competence. He moved through the town with the ease of a man who knew the land and the people, though the town's folk could not yet see it. When he helped mend a broken wagon wheel or guided a lost horse back to its corral, those who watched from a distance began to notice the precision in his work, the patience that seemed endless, and the calm authority that no one dared question. She often thought about the life he had led before meeting her. He had grown up among the vast plains, learning the ways of his people, tracking, hunting, understanding the land, and respecting it in ways she could barely imagine. He had faced dangers most would not survive and had carried himself through years of challenges that had honed him into a man of skill and unshakable resolve. These things he did not boast about. They were simply part of who he was, and she had learned to recognize the quiet power in every movement, in every decision he made. Her own past, though less perilous, had shaped her in ways that few in the town understood. She had been raised under the strict rules of a family obsessed with propriety, with expectations that left little room for choice. Her heart had longed for freedom, for a life she could call her own, yet she had always felt constrained by the walls of judgment that surrounded her. Meeting him had changed everything. His presence had unlocked courage she had not known she possessed, and marrying him had been an act of defiance as much as an act of love. The townsfolk did not yet realize the man they had dismissed as an outsider held more than skill. He held a reputation that preceded him, a name whispered in the far reaches of the plains and mountains. Few dared speak it aloud for fear of drawing attention, but those who had encountered him in past years remembered a figure of respect, a man whose actions could not be ignored. The realization of this would eventually reach the town, and when it did, the shift in attitude would be dramatic. But for now, they only sensed it vaguely, a shadow they could not fully grasp. She spent her mornings walking through the town's edge, learning the routines of her neighbors, understanding the ways people moved and spoke. Her husband accompanied her sometimes, silent and alert, reading the landscape in ways that went unnoticed by everyone else. He could sense when someone approached with ill intent, when the wind carried a warning, or when a situation required careful attention. She admired him for it, even as she wished the town could see what she already knew, that his calm demeanor masked a mind as sharp and formidable as any she had ever known. One afternoon they came across a small group of children playing near the creek. The children froze when they saw him, unsure whether to run or stay. Their parents, visible on the hillsides, had not warned them, but the fear in their hesitation was clear. He knelt down slowly, keeping his movements gentle and unthreatening. His dark eyes met theirs with warmth, a smile just barely touching his lips. It was a lesson in trust, and over the next few minutes, the children edged closer, curiosity overtaking fear. He showed them how to skip stones and pointed out tracks in the mud, and slowly the laughter began to return. She watched, realizing that the smallest acts often spoke louder than words. Yet, even as moments of peace unfolded, there was no escaping the tension that lingered. The townsfolk continued their quiet observations, whispering questions that were never fully answered. Some were curious, some cautious, and some openly hostile, though none dared approach directly. It was clear that the man she had married held secrets, and even without knowing them, the town sensed a power that challenged their assumptions. In the evenings, they would sit together near the cabin, listening to the wind roll across the plains. She asked questions about his life, about the traditions and lessons of his people. He spoke sparingly, each word chosen carefully, painting pictures of a world she had never fully known. He told of the long hunts that tested endurance, of the nights spent under endless stars, of the responsibilities carried for family and community. She listened, absorbing every detail, realizing that the man who had seemed so quiet carried within him a depth of experience that few could imagine. She learned that his people had taught him more than survival. They had taught him honor, resilience, and the value of loyalty. Every skill he demonstrated in town was a reflection of that upbringing, every decision made with thought and precision. Even as the town whispered and judged, she could see the way his presence shifted the environment. Horses were calm near him, neighbors treated him cautiously, and even strangers respected his space. There was a gravity to him that demanded recognition, though most were too stubborn to acknowledge it outright. At night, she sometimes felt the old fears creep back, the fear that the town would never accept them, that prejudice might find a way to disrupt the fragile balance they had begun to build. But he always reassured her, not with grand speeches, but with small gestures, a hand on her shoulder, a steady glance, a silent promise that whatever came, they would face it together. It was in these moments that she felt the depth of their bond, the unspoken trust that had grown stronger with every challenge, every stare, every whispered insult they had endured. One day, a stranger arrived in town, a man dressed in worn leather with a badge pinned to his chest. He moved with authority, and the townsfolk immediately drew back, sensing that his presence might carry news or judgment. He asked questions, measured and deliberate, and she noticed her husband's eyes narrow slightly as he assessed the newcomer. She felt a shiver of anticipation, knowing that something significant was about to unfold. The stranger spoke carefully, his words carrying weight. He had heard stories of the man she had married, fragments passed along by travelers and traders, stories of deeds performed on distant lands, of courage and skill that bordered on legendary. The townsfolk listened, incredulous at first, then slowly. As the stranger's words sank in, a murmur of recognition began to ripple through the crowd. Their attitudes wavered, some faces hardening with disbelief, others softening with a dawning awareness. She watched, her heart a mixture of pride and anxiety. The man she had chosen had always been more than they could see at first glance, and now the truth was beginning to surface. She knew that the revelation would not bring simple acceptance. There would be resistance, envy, and perhaps fear. But she also knew that this was the moment when perceptions could start to shift, when the town might finally understand the man who had won her heart. Yet even as the story of his past spread, questions remained unanswered. What had he faced to earn such respect? What dangers had he overcome? And most importantly, what would the town do with this newfound knowledge? The answers were uncertain, and that uncertainty created a tension that hung over every interaction. She could feel it in the hesitant glances, the careful words and the unspoken judgments that lingered in the air. Her husband remained calm, as always, a steady presence in the storm of attention. He did not boast or claim his accomplishments. He let the truth speak for itself through observation and action. It was a quiet power, one that demanded recognition without begging for it. She had learned to see it, to trust it, and now the town would have to learn as well, whether they were ready or not. Evenings became moments of reflection and preparation. She and he discussed strategies, not for battle or conflict, but for navigating the complex web of suspicion and awe that now defined their daily lives. She marveled at the patience he showed, the way he considered every possibility, every outcome, and every potential reaction. It was a skill born of necessity, honed over years of experience, and one that she had come to rely on more than she could articulate. One night, as they stood on the ridge overlooking the town, she felt the weight of the horizon pressing down. The sun had dipped behind distant mountains, casting long shadows that stretched across the plains. The town lay quiet below, yet she sensed the stirrings of change. The seeds of recognition had been planted, but their growth was uncertain, fragile. She could feel it in the air, the way the wind shifted, the way the people moved, and she knew that the true test was still to come. He turned to her, dark eyes meeting hers in a gaze that spoke without words. She understood completely. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The town might resist, misunderstand, or even fear what they did not yet comprehend, but she would not waver. She had chosen him, and she would stand by him, just as he had stood by her from the very beginning. And so they remained on the ridge, watching, waiting, feeling the quiet tension that surrounded them. The town below might soon realize the full measure of who he was, or they might remain blinded by ignorance for longer than she hoped. Either way, the horizon promised change, and the story of her choice, of his identity, and of the fragile balance between respect and prejudice was far from over. With the stars beginning to emerge in the vast night sky, she felt a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The town's understanding was approaching, slowly, deliberately, and she could sense that when it fully arrived, it would alter everything. The moment of reckoning was near, but the outcome remained hidden, a secret waiting to be revealed. And in that quiet, endless space between expectation and truth, she held tightly to his hand, knowing that together they were ready for whatever was to come. The town had not slept well since the stranger's arrival, and neither had she. Even the early morning light brought no relief, only the sense of waiting, of anticipation that made every small sound feel significant. Horses whinnied in distant stables, carts creaked on worn boards, and the faint murmur of voices carried across the empty streets. Everyone seemed aware, though few admitted it aloud, that something was shifting. And in the center of that tension, she felt the weight of it all pressing against her chest. Her husband rose before dawn as usual, his movements deliberate and calm. He prepared their simple breakfast with the same precision he showed in every task, as though the day's uncertainty had no power over him. She watched him, marveling at how his presence alone seemed to stabilize her. Even when whispers of the town reached her ears, even when judgment hung in the air like a storm cloud, he was steady, unshaken. She took comfort in that, yet the gnawing anxiety remained how long before the town could no longer ignore the truth about him. The whispers had grown bolder. Shopkeepers who had once greeted her politely now edged around her as though unsure whether to speak at all. Children followed her with curiosity tinged with fear, mimicking her every step while their parents watched anxiously from porches. The stranger's words had spread, though incomplete, leaving gaps that imagination and suspicion filled with exaggeration. She sensed eyes on her husband wherever he went, measuring him, testing him, unsure whether the man they had once dismissed was a threat, a hero, or something beyond their understanding. She decided to visit the edge of the town where the plains began and the horizon stretched endless. She needed space to breathe, to think. Her husband followed silently, scanning the terrain as though he could read the land itself. They walked side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, a quiet reassurance in the chaos surrounding them. As they neared the creek that ran along the town's border, they encountered a group of traders unloading supplies from a wagon. One of them, a wiry man with a cautious gaze, spoke first, eyes darting nervously between her and her husband. "I heard about your husband. They say he's not like any man around here. That he's someone else entirely." His voice wavered, betraying a mixture of fear and awe. Her husband's expression did not change. He only nodded once, acknowledging the words without giving them power. She felt a surge of pride but also unease. The town had begun to notice, and with notice came scrutiny, questions, and perhaps danger. Back in town, the council had gathered quietly in the old hall, the room filled with tension. Elder men and women argued in hushed tones, the words sharp beneath the polite veneer. They had known the stranger's reputation from distant lands, stories of bravery and leadership whispered through traders and wanderers. To realize that he was now among them and married to one of their own was enough to unsettle even the most rigid minds. Some council members feared what this might mean for the town's safety. Others, quietly impressed, wondered whether they had judged too quickly if the man they had labeled an outsider might be their only hope should trouble arrive. One of them, a stern-faced woman who had always valued order above all, leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. "We must observe, but we must not provoke. If he is as capable as they say, anger could bring consequences none of us are prepared for." Meanwhile, in her own household, tension took another form. Her younger brother, who had grown up protective and wary, visited under the pretense of concern. Yet his eyes betrayed doubt, fear, and lingering prejudice. He watched her husband carefully, studied his every motion as though trying to measure the man's worth against the stories he had heard. She could see the struggle in him, the conflict between familial loyalty and ingrained bias. She wished she could reach him, explain everything, but words felt insufficient. Only time, observation, and experience could shift hearts in the way she knew was necessary. Even the children in town had begun to play a subtle role. They mimicked her husband's movements, copied the way he handled tools and animals, and began to respect him silently. The adults noticed, some with alarm, others with begrudging admiration. The small gestures of influence were subtle but growing, a quiet sign that the tide of opinion might eventually turn, though when and how remained uncertain. The night brought another challenge. A group of men, emboldened by ignorance and old prejudices, tried to confront him at the edge of the saloon. They questioned his place in the town, the wisdom of the marriage, and even the safety of having someone they did not understand so close. Her husband faced them without threat, without aggression, yet every word he spoke carried weight. He reminded them of principles they had long claimed to value: honesty, skill, courage, and loyalty. He did not demand respect. He illustrated it. Slowly, the crowd began to waver, unsure whether to challenge him further. She watched from the doorway, her heart racing, aware that each confrontation brought new layers of risk and revelation. It was a delicate balance. Every act, every word could tip the scale toward acceptance or disaster. She realized that the town's prejudice was not the only danger. Assumptions, envy, and fear all worked against them. At home, as the fire crackled in the hearth, they discussed the subtle shifts in the town's behavior. He explained that recognition and respect were often slow to arrive, especially when ignorance had a long-standing grip. He spoke of patience and strategy, of how observing and responding deliberately could alter perception more effectively than confrontation. She listened, absorbing every lesson, realizing that her own strength had to grow alongside his if they were to face the challenges ahead. The next day brought another layer of complication. Travelers arrived with news from distant regions. stories of bandits, territorial disputes, and political unrest. These reports carried an unspoken warning. The town could soon face threats beyond its walls. For her husband, these were not merely stories. They were signs, subtle patterns in the movement of people, animals, and information. He studied the reports carefully, noting details that others overlooked. She observed him, impressed at the way his mind worked, piecing together strategy from fragments of information that most would dismiss. Meanwhile, the townspeople began to shift in small, unpredictable ways. Some offered cautious assistance, others tried to test him with subtle challenges, and a few, still entrenched in suspicion, watched from shadows. Each interaction was a test, a puzzle, and she realized that every day would demand patience, vigilance, and courage. She began to understand that her role was not only to stand beside him but to navigate the complex social landscape, to act as both ally and witness to the unfolding transformation of perception around them. One evening, a messenger arrived from the neighboring settlement carrying urgent word. There had been an altercation near the northern ridge, a clash over disputed land and resources. The news traveled quickly, igniting whispers and concern in the town. For her husband, it was an opportunity to demonstrate not only skill but leadership, to show the people firsthand why the stories of his past were not exaggeration. She sensed the tension rising again, knowing that each step forward came with risk. As they prepared to leave for the ridge, she noticed her younger brother linger in the shadows, torn between fear, loyalty, and curiosity. She called to him, trying to bridge the gap, but he only nodded reluctantly, unsure whether to follow or stay behind. She felt the complexity of the moment, family ties strained by judgment, honor tested by perception, and courage measured not only by action, but by the willingness to stand beside those we care for. The ride to the northern ridge was silent but charged with anticipation. The plains stretched wide, empty yet full of possibility, and every sound carried meaning: the distant cry of a hawk, the rustle of grass, the faint clatter of horses on the trail. Her husband moved with purpose, scanning the landscape, noting potential threats, and planning his approach. She rode beside him, her own senses heightened, feeling the weight of responsibility and the edge of danger that had become constant companions. When they arrived, the scene was tense. A group of settlers had gathered, armed more with fear than skill, facing a band of men who had crossed into disputed territory. The standoff was delicate, fraught with risk, and the townspeople, some of whom had come along, watched nervously. Her husband dismounted slowly, hands open in gesture of peace, yet every movement carried authority. He spoke calmly, clearly, and with command, negotiating a resolution with precision that left the onlookers stunned. The conflict diffused, at least temporarily, but the tension lingered. She realized that his presence did more than protect. It reshaped perception. Those who had doubted, judged, or feared him began to reconsider. They saw skill, wisdom, and courage in ways they had not before. Yet, even as admiration grew, so did jealousy, suspicion, and unease. The seeds of respect had been planted, but they were delicate, and any misstep could undo the fragile balance. As they returned to town, the shadows of uncertainty stretched long across the plains. She knew the next days would bring more challenges, more tests of character, more confrontations, and more opportunities for both recognition and resistance. The town's perception was shifting, slowly, unevenly, and the tension that had haunted her from the first day of their arrival remained, a constant reminder that understanding and respect were never easily earned. That night, as the stars spilled across the sky, she sat by the fire and reflected on the day's events. The townspeople were beginning to see pieces of the man she had chosen, but no one yet understood the full measure of his strength, skill, and honor. The conflict was far from resolved. Subplots unfolded in every direction, family ties strained by prejudice, Children watching and learning, strangers arriving with news that could change everything. Each thread wove into a tapestry of uncertainty, suspense, and growing tension. She reached for her husband's hand, and he offered a reassuring squeeze. They did not speak, for words were unnecessary. They both understood that the challenges ahead required vigilance, strategy, and patience. The town might eventually accept them, respect him, or even fear what they had dismissed, but that moment had not yet come. The horizon promised change, but it also promised trials. And as the wind whispered across the plains, carrying the faint scent of dust, sage, and the unknown, she felt the weight of all that was to come. The town, her family, and the strangers who arrived with urgent news all played a part in the unfolding story. The conflict was alive, dynamic, and unresolved, stretching toward a future that none could predict. She and her husband sat in silence, aware that the days ahead would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. The story of her choice, the town's prejudice, and the man who had captured her heart was far from over. The tension would continue to build, and the truth, once fully revealed, would not be easily contained. For now, they waited, watched, and prepared, knowing that the moment of reckoning was approaching, and that every choice, every action, and every word would shape the path forward. The wind had shifted, carrying a strange tension through the town as if even the plains themselves sensed the change. She walked beside him down the main street, aware that every eye followed them, that every whisper held equal parts curiosity, fear, and admiration. The stranger's earlier words had spread like wildfire, and now even those who had doubted him began to hesitate in their judgments. It was as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what the man they had dismissed as an outsider would do next. Her husband moved with the same calm authority that had always defined him. There was no arrogance in his posture, no need for recognition beyond what his actions demanded. Yet in every step, every glance, he radiated the kind of presence that could not be ignored. Children stopped their games to watch him pass, and even the most skeptical adults found themselves unsure how to respond. There was a weight to him now, a gravity that was impossible to deny, and it made her chest swell with a mix of pride and apprehension. That afternoon, a messenger arrived with news from the northern ridge, the site of the previous altercation. The report was urgent. A band of riders, armed and dangerous, had been spotted moving toward the town. The town council met quickly, their faces pale, realizing that the threat they had long feared might finally be at their door. Panic stirred in whispers, but her husband's eyes narrowed with focus, calculating, assessing. Every detail of the report, every fragment of information was absorbed, processed, and considered. He was already planning the next steps before anyone else could even comprehend the danger. She watched him move among the town elders, speaking with measured words, giving instructions with precision that left little room for doubt. He organized a watch, coordinated defenses, and ensured that families knew where to shelter if the riders arrived. There was no fear in his movements, only certainty. And yet, the tension in the air was electric, sharp enough to cut, as if the town itself felt the weight of what was coming. Even her younger brother, who had remained wary, found himself drawn into the preparations. He followed instructions, helped where he could, and observed the calm authority of the man he had once doubted. She noted the shift in him with quiet satisfaction. Slowly, piece by piece, the walls of prejudice were cracking, though there was still a long road ahead before true understanding could be achieved. The sun dipped low in the sky, painting the plains in streaks of fire and shadow. The riders had not yet appeared, but the anticipation of conflict made every sound sharper, every movement deliberate. She and her husband rode along the edge of town, scanning the horizon, noting patterns in the terrain that others would have missed. It was a delicate dance of preparation, awareness, and vigilance. She felt the tension coil inside her, the same tension she saw mirrored in the faces of the townspeople who dared to peek from windows or doorways. As night fell, the first distant thunder of hooves echoed across the valley. A group of riders appeared, silhouettes against the fading light, moving with intent and speed. The townspeople froze, caught between fear and fascination, as her husband stepped forward. He did not shout or threaten. He only moved with purpose, signaling for the town's defenders to take their positions. She could see the children and elders retreating to safe spots, while the men who had once mocked him now braced themselves for the approaching danger. The riders closed the distance, and tension became almost unbearable. Dust rose from the plains, swirling around the town like a living thing. The riders' intentions were unclear, but every movement was precise, calculated, and dangerous. She gripped the reins tightly, feeling her heart hammer in her chest, yet she trusted him completely. He had faced challenges far beyond this, and she knew he would meet whatever came with skill and courage. The first rider arrived at the edge of town, and a voice called out, sharp and demanding. The strangers had not anticipated the presence of someone so capable, and for a moment, hesitation flickered across their faces. Her husband's eyes held them, steady and unyielding, and the silence that followed was thicker than any words. She felt the town's collective heartbeat, tense, anxious, waiting for what would happen next. From multiple directions, more riders appeared, their numbers growing, their movements coordinated. It was clear this was no mere raid. It was a test of strength, strategy, and resolve. Her husband gave precise instructions, positioning defenders, signaling for reinforcements, and ensuring that every possible contingency was accounted for. She watched in awe, recognizing the depth of his experience and the clarity of his mind under pressure. Meanwhile, the town itself became a participant in the unfolding drama. Families watched from windows and rooftops, some with fear, others with a newfound respect. Men who had once doubted him now took cues from his actions, adjusting their own movements to reinforce his strategy. Children learned silently, absorbing lessons in courage and observation without fully understanding them. The town was alive with tension, every soul caught in the pull of uncertainty, admiration, and anticipation. She noticed subtle shifts in the expressions of the riders as well. They had expected easy targets, an unprepared town, and a man they could dismiss. What they found instead was a community subtly but decisively guided by someone whose skill and presence could not be ignored. Hesitation crept into their formations, their confidence faltering as her husband assessed, calculated, and countered every movement with precision. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes under the strain of anticipation. Every action, every decision carried immense weight. She could see the exhaustion begin to creep into the defenders' faces, and yet her husband's steady presence kept them aligned, focused, and resolute. The night was thick with the tension of confrontation, every rustle, every shadow, every distant sound amplified by fear and expectation. In the midst of the standoff, a rider broke from the main group, charging toward the town with speed and aggression. Her husband met him head-on, blocking the advance without hostility but with absolute authority. The rider faltered under the quiet power of his presence, unsure whether to retreat or continue. She held her breath, heart pounding, knowing that every second mattered, every movement a potential turning point. Back in town, the council watched anxiously. Some began to realize that their earlier judgments had been hasty, their prejudices unfounded. They whispered among themselves, noting the calm, decisive action of the man they had once dismissed. Yet even as respect began to grow, so did fear, for the potential consequences of misjudgment were still unknown. The tension was a living thing, flowing through the streets, the buildings, and the people, binding them all together in anticipation of what would happen next. She turned her gaze to the ridge, where the full group of riders had gathered, silhouetted against the night sky. The number of adversaries was overwhelming, yet her husband did not show doubt. His eyes scanned the terrain, calculating distances, assessing threats, and planning every movement. She realized that what they were facing was not merely an external challenge. It was a test of leadership, courage, and the town's ability to rise beyond fear and prejudice. The riders hesitated, sensing the authority and skill that opposed them. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in their ranks. Her husband's calm, unwavering presence radiated like a shield over the town, giving strength to the defenders and planting doubt in the attackers. The tension reached a crescendo, a taut wire stretched to its limit, every heartbeat echoing with the possibility of confrontation, triumph, or disaster. She could feel the weight of history pressing down, the echoes of her family's prejudices, the town's fears, and the stranger's reputation all colliding in the night. Every choice, every action in the coming moments would matter, shaping the perception of him, of her, and of the town itself. She realized that the story they had begun together, once personal and private, had become something larger, a test of courage, trust, and understanding that extended far beyond their own lives. The first volleys of tension escalated into movement as the riders advanced in small groups, testing the town's defenses, probing for weakness. Her husband countered, guiding the defenders, positioning them strategically, and anticipating each shift. She followed, staying close, observing how he read the battlefield with ease and confidence. Each decision was calculated, precise, and unflinching. She knew that the climax of this confrontation was near, that the moment when the town would see the full measure of his skill, courage, and character was almost upon them. Even the children, who had watched from windows and rooftops, sensed the shift in the air. They whispered to each other, pointing out movements and actions they did not fully understand but recognized as significant. Adults exchanged glances, some with fear, some with awe, all caught in the suspense of what was about to unfold. The riders began to regroup, realizing that their initial movements had been countered with skill and authority. Tension coiled like a spring, ready to release in violence or surrender. She gripped her husband's hand tightly, feeling the same calm assurance he radiated even as the world around them trembled with uncertainty. The town held its breath, caught between hope, fear, and anticipation, waiting for the next move that would tip the balance. And then, from the shadows at the edge of the ridge, another figure appeared, observing the unfolding standoff. The arrival was sudden, silent, and commanding. Her husband's eyes flicked to the figure, noting the presence immediately, aware that this was another variable in the complex web of tension that now surrounded them. Every instinct, every experience, every skill he had honed was in play. The town could sense it, the riders could sense it, and she felt it in her own chest, the culmination of suspense, the edge of the climax that had been building for days. The night grew colder, the plains dark and silent except for the subtle sounds of movement and breath. Every second stretched longer, charged with anticipation. Her husband remained the anchor in the storm, a beacon of calm authority that gave hope to the defenders and cast uncertainty into the hearts of the riders. She felt the weight of every eye on them, the significance of every decision, and the almost unbearable suspense of what was coming next. The horizon trembled with expectation, the town held in suspense, and she knew that the resolution was near but not yet. Every moment of tension, every flicker of doubt, every whispered fear had led to this point. And as the wind swept across the plains, carrying the faint scent of dust and horse, she realized that the climax was at hand. The next moments would determine not only the fate of the town but the recognition of the man she had chosen and the courage of a woman who had stood by him through every shadow of doubt. She tightened her grip on his hand, feeling the quiet reassurance and knowing that whatever came, they would face it together. The night held its breath, the town waited, and the tension stretched taut as a wire. The culmination of all the whispered judgments, fears, and untested courage was poised to break in an instant. Every glance, every movement, every heartbeat counted now. And in that suspended moment, nothing was certain and everything was possible. The night held its breath, the tension hanging thick over the town like a heavy fog. Every eye was fixed on the riders and the figure who had emerged at the ridge. She felt her heart hammering, but there was no fear in her husband's stance. His calm presence radiated certainty, and she drew strength from it. The town, frozen in anticipation, seemed to lean toward him as if instinctively knowing that the moment of truth had arrived. The riders hesitated, shifting uneasily in the moonlight. Their numbers were formidable, but her husband's command of the situation was undeniable. He stepped forward, voice firm yet steady, and addressed them directly. His words carried authority, intelligence, and the quiet confidence of a man who had faced greater dangers and prevailed. The riders faltered, unsure whether to challenge him, retreat, or surrender. She watched him, her chest swelling with pride. She had always known the depth of his skill, courage, and honor, but to see it displayed before the entire town and before those who had once doubted him was extraordinary. He moved with precision, guiding the defenders, assessing the land, and reading the enemy's intentions like a map laid bare. Every action reinforced the truth that she had known from the start. The man she had chosen was extraordinary in every way. The riders, finally understanding the futility of their aggression, slowly began to lower their weapons. Some turned to leave, while others exchanged glances of reluctant respect. The tension that had been so unbearable just moments before began to ease, replaced by a mixture of awe and relief. The town's defenders, emboldened by his leadership, stood taller, their confidence restored. She could see the change in their eyes, the recognition of someone worthy of respect and admiration. Her younger brother approached cautiously, still uncertain, yet drawn forward by what he had witnessed. He stopped in front of her husband, eyes lowered for a moment before meeting the calm, steady gaze that welcomed no judgment, only acknowledgment. I see now," he said softly. "I was wrong to doubt you." The words, simple as they were, carried weight, and she felt a sense of closure ripple through her. The walls of prejudice that had loomed for years began to crumble in that single moment of recognition. The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, offering cautious applause, nods, and murmurs of approval. They had watched, they had waited, and now they understood. The man they had once dismissed as an outsider, the Apache she had married, was not only capable but honorable, wise, and courageous. Fear melted into respect, suspicion into admiration. She could see the subtle shifts in posture, the softened expressions, and the quiet acceptance growing like a slow dawn across the town. The figure at the ridge, the stranger who had first drawn attention to her husband's reputation, finally spoke. "I have traveled far," he said, voice carrying clearly over the quiet town, "and I have seen many men of courage. But few possess the wisdom and the skill I have witnessed tonight. You are a man of legend in your own right, and the town would do well to honor that." Her husband nodded, acknowledging the words with humility. There was no boast, no claim, only the quiet acknowledgment that truth could not be denied. She felt the weight of relief wash over her, mingled with pride and gratitude. The town had seen what she had always known, that the man she had married was extraordinary. Yet, beyond the admiration, there was something more profound, the recognition that courage, skill, and honor were not bound by appearance, heritage, or the judgments of others. In the days that followed, the town slowly returned to its rhythms, but the change in perception was permanent. The whispers of doubt transformed into words of respect. Curiosity became admiration, and old prejudices began to fade. Families approached her husband for advice, neighbors sought his guidance, and even the children, who had once watched from a distance, now followed his example with eagerness. The influence he had brought into the town was subtle yet profound, reshaping relationships and opening minds in ways that words alone could never achieve. Her younger brother, now fully reconciled, worked alongside her husband, learning from his skill and observing his wisdom. He no longer questioned, no longer feared, and instead embraced the lessons offered. She watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the bonds of family had grown stronger through understanding, patience, and shared experience. Even the council members, who had initially doubted and feared him, now recognized the value he brought. They spoke openly of his deeds, praised his leadership, and admitted that their early judgments had been misguided. The town, once divided by prejudice, had found unity and respect for the man who had proven himself not through words, but through action, courage, and honor. She and her husband continued to move through the town together, now greeted with smiles, nods, and genuine warmth. The children ran to meet them, eager for guidance or just the reassurance of a presence they had come to admire. Women thanked her husband for his protection and wisdom, and men sought his advice in matters of skill, strategy, and leadership. The transformation was remarkable, a testament to patience, courage, and the power of integrity. One afternoon, as the sun cast its golden light across the plains, they stood together on the ridge overlooking the town. She felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that the struggle of perception, prejudice, and doubt had been met and overcome. The town had seen the truth, and in that revelation, the bonds between them had grown stronger, richer, and more meaningful. Her husband turned to her, dark eyes warm, steady, and full of affection. "You were right," he said simply. "The town needed time to see what I am. And you have always known." She smiled, feeling the quiet depth of their bond, the shared understanding that had carried them through every challenge. They did not need grand words or declarations. The journey, the trials, and the ultimate recognition had spoken for itself. The townspeople continued to gather, not in fear or suspicion, but in celebration of courage and honor. Children laughed and played without hesitation. Men and women offered greetings without judgment, and even those who had clung to old prejudices now approached with a mix of curiosity and respect. The town had shifted, transformed not through force, but through witness, experience, and the undeniable proof of character. She felt the satisfaction of seeing the subplots resolve. Her family, once fractured by fear and doubt, was now whole, understanding, and supportive. The town, once divided by judgment, had found unity and shared respect. And the man she had married, whose presence had been questioned and doubted, was now recognized as a leader, protector, and friend. The final test had been met not with violence alone, but with strategy, courage, and integrity. Every action her husband had taken, every choice he had made, had contributed to the ultimate resolution. And she realized that the story of their union, their trials, and the town's transformation was a lesson in patience, trust, and the power of character to overcome prejudice. In the quiet moments after the confrontation, as they sat together beneath the stars, she reflected on the journey. Every whisper of doubt, every fearful glance, every test of courage had brought them to this point. The town had learned, slowly but surely, that appearances could deceive, but character and action revealed truth. She held his hand tightly, feeling the quiet reassurance that whatever challenges might come, they would face them together, strengthened by every trial they had endured. The horizon stretched wide and open, a promise of new beginnings and continued peace. The wind carried a sense of calm, of resolution, and of hope. The town was no longer a place of whispered judgment, but a community reshaped by understanding, respect, and shared experience. Every individual who had once doubted had now witnessed the truth, and the ripple of that understanding would continue for generations. Her husband stood, looking out over the plains, and she knew that this moment was more than a victory. It was a testament to what could be achieved through courage, patience, and unwavering integrity. The town had been tested, and they had grown. Prejudice had been confronted, fear had been tempered, and respect had been earned. As the sun rose on a new day, the town stirred to life with renewed energy. Children played freely. Adults worked together with cooperation rather than suspicion, and her husband moved among them not as an outsider, but as a respected member of the community. She walked beside him, feeling the peace and pride that came from seeing the full measure of a man revealed and honored. In the following weeks, the story of what had happened spread beyond the town. Travelers spoke of the man who had led the town through a test of courage and skill, and the woman who had stood beside him, unwavering in faith and love. Their tale became a lesson not of fear or prejudice, but of respect, understanding, and the transformative power of integrity. And finally, in the quiet of the evening, she looked at him, and he at her, and knew that the trials they had faced had forged something unbreakable. Love, respect, courage, and trust, these were the foundations of their life together, stronger than any doubt, stronger than any whisper of judgment. They had faced the storm, and now, together, they could walk into the future with confidence, knowing that the hardest battles had been won not just with skill, but with heart. The town, once filled with whispers of doubt and judgment, now echoed with laughter, respect, and quiet admiration. Families shared stories of courage and unity, neighbors offered genuine greetings, and the children played under the open sky, learning by example what it meant to live with honor. The transformation was complete, and the peace that settled over the plains was both deserved and hard-earned. She rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the calm, steady beat of his heart and the weight of every moment that had brought them here. The struggles, the whispers, the fear, and the tension all had led to this resolution. And as the stars emerged in the night sky, she knew that the story of their courage, their love, and the respect they had earned would endure. The town had learned that strength and honor could come from unexpected places, and that love and loyalty were the truest measures of a person. The riders had left, the danger had passed, and what remained was a community transformed, a family reconciled, and a love validated beyond doubt. And in that quiet, perfect moment, she smiled, knowing that they had not only survived, but had built a life where respect, understanding, and courage would guide every step forward. The horizon was bright, the plains wide, and the story of a woman who married an Apache and the man who had proved himself to all would live on, remembered for the triumph of integrity, love, and unwavering courage.